The deposits Eleanor cloned from my shop were signed back to me by morning. Pour yourself something, and I'll tell you how. Sit with me a minute, because I have wanted to tell someone this the way it actually happened, and you are the kind of listener who won't rush me to the part where she loses. The first thing you should know is what my stepdaughter said to me across her father's dining table on the 4th of October, 2 years ago, holding her fork like a small conductor's baton, smiling the whole time. She said, "Violet, you arrange flowers for weddings you'll never be invited to, and you honestly think you understand business." She said it warmly. That was the trick of Eleanor, the reason nobody ever believed me. She could hand you a knife and make it feel like a compliment, and everyone at the table laughed, and I laughed too, because in that house you learned to laugh or you learned to leave. She thought she had measured me exactly. She had spent 31 years being the smartest person in every room she entered, and she assumed I was the soft one, the second wife, the woman who smelled of eucalyptus and cold water and knew nothing. I let her think it. I want you to understand that I let her think it on purpose, and I'll get to why, but not yet. She had no idea what she was standing on. She never once looked down. Let me tell you who I am first, because the ending doesn't land unless you know the ground it grew from. My name is Violet Carrington, though for 34 of my 36 years, I was Violet Osei, and I grew up in a narrow brick house in Toledo, Ohio, over my mother's flower shop, which she called Osei and Bloom, even though there was no partner named Bloom. She just liked how it sounded, like a firm, like something that had lasted. My mother, Adjoa, came from Kumasi to Ohio in 1983 with 2 suitcases and a laminated card of Twi proverbs she'd copied out in blue ink. And she built that shop, cutting stems until her hands cracked at the knuckle every winter. I did my first funeral spray at 9 years old. I could strip a rose of its lower thorns in the dark by the time I was 11, running my thumb up the stem the way you'd read Braille. What I want you to hold on to is that I was raised in a business, an actual business, with a ledger and a cold room and a supplier in Miami who called at 4 a.m. during Valentine's week. And I watched my mother be underestimated for 4 straight decades by loan officers and landlords and men who assumed the woman with the accent couldn't read a contract. She could read a contract better than any of them. She taught me to read the fine print out loud, twice, and then a third time, backward, looking only for the sentences a person hopes you'll skim. That is the seed of everything I am about to tell you. Remember it. It matters more than any of the fireworks later. I moved to Michigan in 2016 to a lake town called Harbor Reach on the west side of the state, where the water goes the color of pewter in November and the whole place smells like cold stone and diesel from the marina. I opened my own shop there, a small storefront on Ferry Street between a bait store and a shuttered video rental place that still had the yellow return slot in the door. And I named it Wren and Ivy, and I ran it lean and honest for 6 years. Weddings, mostly. I did 211 weddings before any of this started, and I kept a shoebox of thank you cards under the register that I never showed anyone because it felt like bragging. My whole business ran on deposits. A bride pays me a $500 deposit to hold her August date, sometimes $800 for the big ones, and that money is a promise. It's the most fragile trust in my whole trade, and you'll see in a minute why that detail is the entire hinge of this story. I met Gerald Carrington in the spring of 2019 at a Chamber of Commerce breakfast I only attended because they gave you a free centerpiece slot to advertise. He was 54 then, a commercial real estate man with a warm laugh and a habit of remembering the name of every waiter, and I mistook that habit for kindness for almost 3 years. He had one daughter from his first marriage, Eleanor, and he spoke about her the way some men speak about a stock they own too much of, with pride that had curdled into something more like fear. Eleanor Carrington was, by every public measure, magnificent. She was 31, she had an MBA from Ross, She ran a design and branding firm called Dovetail Design out of a converted grain elevator in Grand Rapids, and she sat on the board of the Children's Hospital and read to second graders one Friday a month and had a laugh that landlords and reporters and my own husband all leaned toward like it was a warm stove. That is the hardest kind of person to expose, you understand. Not the snarling villain, the beloved one. The one who, when you finally say what she did, makes the whole room look at you like you're the one who's broken something. Now let me tell you how she wore me down, because it wasn't one blow, it was a season of small ones, and I want you to feel each of them the way I did. The first was the toast. Gerald and I married in June of 2020, a small thing on the back deck because of everything happening that year, and Eleanor gave a toast in front of the 11 people allowed to gather. She raised a glass of a Riesling she'd brought from a vineyard she part-owned, and she said, "To Dad, who found someone to keep him company now that he's slowing down, and to Violet, who I'm sure will keep the house full of lovely flowers." Keep the house full of lovely flowers. Everyone said, "Aw." I smiled. But I heard it exactly for what it was, which was a fence being built around me, a description of the small size of the yard I was permitted. I had a business with a lease and a payroll and a supplier in Miami, and she'd just introduced me as the help. The second was the Ross ring. She wore this heavy oval class ring from her business school, gold with a garnet, and she had a way of tapping it against a glass or a tabletop when someone said something she found quaint, a little tick-tick against the crystal. Over the years, I learned that sound the way you learn a dog that's about to bite. She tapped it when I mentioned my margins once at Thanksgiving. Tick, tick. "That's adorable," she said. "That's not really scale, Violet. That's a hobby with a cash register." Her father laughed. I did not correct her. Not because I couldn't, but because I had learned something at my mother's cutting table 40 years earlier, that when a person is busy telling you what you are, they stop watching what you're doing. And there is enormous freedom in the moment someone decides they've got you figured out. The third scene is the one I keep returning to, because it's the one where I understood she'd decided I was not a person so much as an obstacle with a pulse. It was a Sunday in February of 2022, and I'd driven the 90 minutes to their family cottage on the North Shore for one of Gerald's asthma flare-ups, bringing the pot of ginger and clove tea I make that my mother made before me. That's a thing you should hold on to, the tea. It's going to come back around later, because it's the one true tenderness in this whole account. Eleanor was there with her business partner and a woman named Dolores Ashby, who ran a competing florist and events outfit 2 towns over called Petal and Ledger, and who Eleanor had begun that winter to fold into the family orbit like a second, better daughter-in-law. I heard them in the kitchen while I steeped the tea. Eleanor was telling Dolores that Harbor Reach's whole wedding market was wildly undermonetized, that the vendors up there were sentimental amateurs sitting on a gold mine they were too soft to squeeze. She used my customer list as an example. My customer list. She had seen it once, over my shoulder, at a holiday dinner. I stood in the hallway holding a pot of my mother's tea, and I understood that my life's work had become, to my stepdaughter, a case study in an argument I wasn't invited to hear. You would have said something. Most people would have. I didn't, and here's the honest reason. I've watched my mother win, and I've watched her lose, and the losses always came when she moved before she was ready, when the anger got out ahead of the plan. So I poured the tea, I carried it in, I gave Gerald his cup, and I filed away 3 facts like pressed flowers between the pages of a book. Eleanor thought Harbor Reach was ripe. Eleanor had a partner in Dolores. And Eleanor had, at some point, looked at my list. Now here's the part where she stopped nibbling at me and took the whole bite. In the last week of August 2022, 3 brides called me on the same afternoon, one after another, each of them apologetic and confused because they had all just gotten emails from Wren and Ivy, from my shop with my logo, my sage green header, the little woodcut wren I'd paid a woman in Portland $90 to draw in 2016, telling them that my payment processor had changed and that their remaining balances, and in 2 cases, their whole redone deposits, should be wired to a new account by Friday to lock in their date. The email was flawless. It used my sign-off, which is a line from a Wendell Berry poem my mother loved, and it used the exact font I use, and the link went to a website that was my website, Violet, letter for letter, comma for comma, down to the shoebox testimonials I'd finally scanned and posted the spring before. Someone had cloned Ren and Ivy, the whole living body of it, the sight and the trust and the voice, and stood it up on a near-identical address, Ren and Ivy Florals-Payments-.com, and pointed it at my own brides to harvest their deposits. 11 couples paid before I got the fraud flag from my bank. $19,400 in deposits, gone to an account that closed itself within 72 hours. And the worst part, the part that kept me awake, wasn't the money. It was the 11 couples who now believed I had taken it. My name, the thing my mother had spent 40 winters building the reputation of, was suddenly the name of a woman who steals from brides. I want to be precise with you about how I knew it was Eleanor, because a story like this is worthless if it runs on a hunch. 2 things. The cloned site's testimonials page had a single testimonial, mine did not. A glowing one from a Marisa T., who did not exist in my records, written in a particular cadence using the phrase, elevated the entire guest experience, which is a phrase from Dovetail Design's own marketing deck, a deck Gerald had once proudly shown me on his tablet. That was the thread. And when I pulled the registration on the clone domain through a service my friend Karen walked me through, it had been bought and paid for through a reseller account that traced, after Karen spent 2 weeks and called in a favor from a forensic accountant named Ruben Ortega she'd known since law school, to a shell LLC whose registered agent shared an address with Petal and Ledger, with Dolores. Eleanor had kept her own fingers clean. She'd built the scheme and handed the shovel to Dolores, the way she'd handed me a knife across a dining table, and called it a toast. I need to tell you about Karen, because she is not a device in this story. She is the reason I survived it. Karen Whitfield and I met over a boundary dispute in 2018. A neighbor of mine claimed my delivery van's oil stains were killing his hydrangeas, which is the kind of case Karen took because she found people funny, and she'd been my closest friend in Harbor Reach ever since. She's 61, she practices out of a 2-room office above the credit union, she drinks a terrible instant chicory she orders from Louisiana by the case, and she has a wire-haired terrier named Motion, as in motion to dismiss, who sleeps on the client chair and has to be lifted off for meetings. When I brought her the cloned website printed out on paper because I didn't trust screens anymore, she read every line twice, then a 3rd time, and then she looked at me over her reading glasses and said the thing I have carried since. Violet, they've built you a very convincing coffin. So we're going to be very quiet, and we're going to be very slow, and we are going to bury this on our schedule, not theirs. She never once told me to calm down. In a season when my own husband kept asking if I might be reading too much into a phishing scam that hits small businesses all the time, Karen believed me on the first afternoon. That mattered more than I can make you feel with words. When everyone treats your certainty like a symptom, one person's plain belief is a floor under your feet. Here is the exact moment I decided. Not the fraud. I hadn't decided anything the day of the fraud. I was just drowning. The moment came 11 days later, at Gerald's 60th birthday dinner in a private room at a lakeside restaurant called The Granary, 40 of us at a long table. Eleanor stood to give a toast. She always gave the toast. And she talked about legacy, about how Carringtons build things that last. And then she looked down the table at me and said gently, for the whole room, "And Violet, I heard about your little website trouble. You have to be so careful when you don't really come from business. These things can just swallow a person who's out of her depth. We're all here for you." Out of her depth. 40 people made a soft, sympathetic sound at me. Gerald patted my hand, and I understood, sitting there with a napkin in my lap and my mother's whole life in my name, that she had not only stolen from me, she was now going to narrate my ruin as a kindness, in public, and be loved for it. That was the moment. Not rage. Rage is loud and it moves too soon. What I felt was a kind of terrible clarity, cool all the way through, like the cold room at 4 a.m. in Valentine's week. I decided, between the salad and the entree, that Eleanor was going to sign every stolen dollar back to me herself, in writing, and that she was going to do it because she had no other choice, and that she would learn, the same night, exactly what she'd been standing on for 2 years without ever looking down. Now let me tell you the thing I'd been sitting on. This is the card, and I'm going to lay it flat for you in one sentence so it's simple, because it needs to be simple. I owned the parent company of the firm Eleanor's whole life ran on. Let me say it plainer than that even. In 2011, back in Toledo, before Michigan, before Gerald, my mother and I took the little bit of money the flower shop had made over 30 years, and on the advice of an old customer who'd become a friend, we put it into a boring, ugly, unglamorous holding company that owned commercial buildings and a couple of small service firms across the Midwest. It was called Meridian Kettle Holdings, and it was the least romantic thing you can imagine. Parking lot leases, a linen supply outfit, the mortgage on a strip mall in Fort Wayne. My mother loved it precisely because it was boring. Boring money, she used to say, is loyal money. When she died in 2018, I inherited her stake, and over the 4 years after that, quietly, while Eleanor was tapping her garnet ring against wine glasses and calling my life a hobby, I had been buying up the rest of Meridian Kettle, share by unglamorous share, until by the spring of 2022, I held the controlling interest. I owned the Boring Company. And the Boring Company, 18 months earlier, in a deal I had personally approved over a folder of documents at Karen's chicory-smelling table, had acquired both the building that housed Dovetail Design, that beautiful converted grain elevator in Grand Rapids, and a majority position in Dovetail's own parent management company, the entity that held Dovetail's operating loan and its lease and its line of credit. So let me put it in the plainest human terms, the way Karen made me practice saying it out loud until a stranger could follow it. Eleanor thought she was a founder and a board member and a Carrington, untouchable. What she actually was, without knowing it, was my tenant and my borrower. I was her landlord. I held her firm's debt. I was, in every way that a courtroom would recognize, the ground under her building and the note under her business. She had spent 2 years telling a room full of people that I didn't come from business, while she quite literally worked inside a building I owned on money my company had lent. I told no one, not Gerald, especially not Gerald. Karen knew, and Reuben, the forensic accountant, knew the pieces he needed, and my mother had known before she died, and that was the whole list. Here's how we prepared, and I'll walk you through it the way I walked through it. Slow, because the slowness is the whole art of it. First, we did not confront Eleanor, and we did not confront Dolores, and we did not tell the 11 couples anything except one careful, true sentence from Karen, that Wren and Ivy had been the victim of a fraud, that I was personally making every deposit whole out of my own pocket that week, and that the matter was under investigation. I wired back all $19,400 myself to 11 couples in the last week of September. It emptied my operating account, and I took a short-term note against the van and the cold room equipment to do it. And I want you to sit with that, because it's the part people forget in these stories. Before any reckoning, I bled for it. I chose to bleed for my own name rather than let it be true for one more week that Violet Carrington steals from brides. Second, Ruben Ortega built the paper. Not a story, not a theory, paper. He traced the Shell LLC that bought the clone domain to Petal & Ledger's registered agent, and then he did the slower, deeper work of tracing the payment for the clone site's hosting and the processor change wording back through 3 accounts to an actual invoice that Dolores had submitted to Dovetail Design, to Eleanor's firm, for brand consulting services in the exact amount and the exact week the clone went live. Eleanor, so careful to keep her own name off the domain, had made one very human mistake. She had run Dolores's fee through her own company's books because Eleanor could not bear to spend her personal money on anything, not even her own crime. Her habit of never paying for a thing herself was the thread that hanged her. Ruben found it in a Tuesday's worth of general ledger entries. Third, and this is the quiet, patient center of the whole thing, I did nothing with the debt or the lease for 4 months. I let the acquisition documents sit in a fireproof box at Karen's office next to a photo of Motion in a party hat, and I waited. Because the 11 couples had filed complaints, and one of them, a bride named Sophia Reyes, whose deposit was the largest, had gone to the county prosecutor, and there was going to be a hearing, a civil matter Karen and I steered it into deliberately, a fraud and unfair trade practices action in the county courthouse of our Lake County, in the small brick courtroom on the 2nd floor with the radiator that knocks. I did not want a back room. I wanted the same daylight Eleanor had used to call me out of my depth in front of 40 people. I wanted the room. And here is a detail I have to give you, because it's the one that tells you who I really am underneath all this cool. The night before the hearing, I couldn't eat and I couldn't sleep, and so I did the only thing that has ever settled me. I made a pot of my mother's ginger and clove tea, the same one I'd carried into that cottage the day I heard Eleanor call my life a gold mine. And I sat at my own kitchen table in Harbor Reach at 2 a.m, and I read the acquisition papers out loud, twice, and then a third time, backward, looking only for the sentence a person hopes you'll skim. There wasn't one. Karen had made sure. My mother would have liked Karen. Now here's the part nobody believes. The hearing was set for a Thursday in late January, and it began, as these things do, with the system leaning the wrong way, leaning toward Eleanor. She arrived at the county courthouse in a camel coat with her father, my husband, on one side, and Dolores on the other, and she'd brought a lawyer from a Grand Rapids firm who cost more per hour than I paid the 4 people on my payroll in a week combined. And she'd brought the room with her. That's the thing about the beloved kind. Half the county knew Eleanor Carrington from the hospital board and the reading program, and when she walked in, people nodded at her. The bailiff smiled, and I could feel the whole gravity of the place tilt toward the woman everyone already liked. When the couple's complaints were read, her lawyer painted a picture of a phishing scam, impersonal, ambient, the kind of thing that happens to small businesses run by people who, and he said this gently, looking at me, may not have had the sophistication to secure their systems. Out of her depth, again, in a new suit, I watched Sophia Reyes, the bride, shrink in her seat, and I watched 2 of the other couples glance at me with the old doubt, and for about 20 minutes, the coffin they'd built me was holding its shape just fine. Then Karen stood up, in a gray suit she'd had since the Clinton administration, and she was very quiet and very slow. She entered Ruben's paper first, not as an accusation, but as a chain. This domain, this shell, this registered agent, this invoice, this ledger line. And she walked the judge through it, one link at a time, in plain language, the way you'd explain a recipe. Dolores's lawyer objected twice and was overruled twice. The invoice landed like a stone in still water. The brand consulting fee, paid by Dovetail Design, in the precise week the clone went live, in the precise amount that matched the hosting and setup costs Ruben had itemized. Eleanor's own books had documented the crime her own hands had been so careful to avoid touching. Her habit of never paying for anything herself, the same reflex that made her run her stepmother's ruin through the company card, was now a line item read aloud in a county courtroom on a Thursday. Her lawyer went still. Dolores's face did something I won't call pale, because that's the stock word, and it wasn't that. It was more that she looked suddenly like a person who'd been walking confidently through a house in the dark and just found the top of a staircase with her foot. But Eleanor didn't break. I told you she wouldn't be the kind who breaks, and she wasn't. She leaned to her lawyer, she wrote something on a legal pad, and when there was a lull, she asked, in that warm, public voice, to address the court herself. And she stood and she said that this was a tragic misunderstanding, that Dolores was a contractor whose independent actions she couldn't be responsible for, that she, Eleanor Carrington, had spent her life building things in this community, and that it was frankly painful to watch her stepmother, and she let the word stepmother hang there, soft and pitying, turn a business misfortune into a personal vendetta out of, and here it was one more time, wearing its third costume of the story, a place of feeling out of her depth. She smiled at me when she said it. She thought the room was still hers. That was the moment I had waited 4 months for. I nodded to Karen, and Karen asked the court's leave to introduce one final set of documents, not to the fraud itself, but to the matter of Eleanor's standing to disclaim responsibility for Dovetail Design's operations. And then Karen laid the acquisition papers on the clerk's table, and she said, in the plainest possible sentence, the sentence we had practiced at the chicory table until a stranger could follow it. Your Honor, the defendant has repeatedly characterized my client as someone outside of business. I'd like the record to reflect that as of 18 months ago, my client's holding company, Meridian Kettle Holdings, acquired both the building in which Dovetail Design operates and the controlling interest in Dovetail's parent management entity. My client, Violet Carrington, is the defendant's landlord. My client holds the note on the defendant's firm. Every day, Eleanor Carrington has spent describing my client as an amateur. She has done so as a tenant from inside a business my client owns. I have replayed the next 4 seconds more times than I'll admit. Eleanor did not go pale, and she did not gasp. What happened was smaller and much worse for her. The garnet ring, the Ross ring she tapped against every wine glass to remind a room how much smarter she was. She was turning it on her finger, around and around, the way you'd wind a watch. And when Karen said landlord, her hand simply stopped. That was all. The tick, tick, that had punctuated 2 years of my humiliation went silent because the finger stopped moving. And in that stillness, I watched Eleanor Carrington do the arithmetic in real time, watched her understand that the woman she had introduced at a wedding as someone to keep the house full of flowers had, the entire time, been holding the lease on her building and the debt on her name and the deed to the very floor under her firm's beautiful grain elevator office, and had said nothing, and had let her go on, and had waited. She looked at me then, really looked, for the first time in 3 years, and I met it, and I did not smile, because the moment did not call for it. My mother didn't smile when she won either. She just used to close the ledger very softly, like putting a child to sleep. The judge did not rule that day on the fraud. That took another 6 weeks, and it went, in the end, entirely against Dolores and against Dovetail Design, with a finding of unfair trade practices, restitution ordered, and a referral to the prosecutor that turned Sophia Reyes's complaint into a criminal file. But the hearing had already done the real thing. By the time the room emptied that Thursday, the gravity had shifted. The bailiff didn't smile at Eleanor on the way out, and Sophia Reyes touched my arm in the hallway and said quietly, "I'm sorry I doubted you. And I want you to know I thanked her and meant it, because doubting me had been the reasonable thing, and believing me had cost her something to say." Now here's how it landed by morning, which is the part of the title I owe you. That night, Eleanor's lawyer called Karen's cell at 9:40. and then again at 11. And by 2 in the morning, the same dead clear hour when I'd sat reading those papers backward over my mother's tea, they had a term sheet. Because you understand what the acquisition papers meant in the practical, dark-of-night way that a person facing them understands. I could call Dovetail's operating loan. I could, as landlord, begin the lawful process on the lease. I did not have to raise my voice or my hand to end her firm. I only had to let the boring, loyal paper do what boring paper does. Eleanor's own lawyer knew it by midnight, and so, rather than watch her landlord and her lender and her stepmother stand across a courtroom from her for the criminal matter to come, Eleanor did the arithmetic all the way to its end. By 6 in the morning, before the courthouse even opened, she had signed, personally, in her own name, not Dolores's, not the company's, a settlement making whole the full $19,400 in stolen deposits, plus my costs, reimbursing the short-term note I'd taken against my own van, and a separate written acknowledgement, on paper, that the fraud had originated from work commissioned and paid through her firm. The woman who had never spent her own money on anything signed her own name to every dollar of it by morning, because it was that, or watch me foreclose the floor out from under, the thing she loved most. Her father, my husband, called it a terrible business for the family. I noticed he still would not say she'd done it. That's the last thing you should know about Gerald, and then I'll leave him. He never once, in all of it, said the words, "She did this." He stood in our kitchen after the settlement and told me he was relieved the money part was sorted, and asked what was for dinner, and I understood, finally and without any drama, that I had married a man who loved comfort more than he would ever love the truth, and that he had let his daughter treat me as furniture for 2 years, because objecting would have cost him his ease. So I made my own arithmetic, cool and clean. I filed for divorce 3 weeks later. I kept Wren and Ivy, which had always been mine. I kept Meridian Kettle, which had always been mine. I kept my mother's name and my mother's tea and the shoebox of thank you cards. And I let Gerald keep his comfort, which was the only thing he'd ever really wanted anyway. There was no war over it. When a thing is legally and plainly yours, you don't have to fight for it. You just carry it out the door. Let me leave you with 2 pictures, because I promised you this story, and a story owes you its last images. The first is a toast, a real one this time. Last June, 1 year after the courtroom, I catered and arranged the wedding of Sophia Reyes, the bride whose complaint had turned the whole tide, and I did it at cost and gave her the peonies for free, 400 stems the color of the inside of a shell, because a florist's oldest apology and oldest thank you is simply the best flowers you have. At the reception, Karen was there, in a dress instead of the gray suit, with Motion the terrier asleep under the table in a bow tie, and Reuben came up from Fort Wayne, and I stood and I raised a glass of ordinary sparkling wine, not from any vineyard anyone part owned, and I said the only toast I've ever given in my life. I said, "To boring money, which is loyal, and to the people who believe you on the first afternoon." Karen laughed so hard she had to sit down. My mother would have liked that too. And the second picture is Eleanor, because you'll want to know, and I'll give it to you coolly the way I've given you everything. Dovetail Design survived, smaller. She kept it. I never took it. Taking it was never the point. The point was that she finally knew who could. But she resigned from the Children's Hospital Board that spring, quietly, a 2-line notice in the Grand Rapids paper, and she stopped reading to the second graders. And the last time I saw her was 8 months ago, across the produce section of the Meijer in Grand Rapids on a Saturday. She was choosing apples, and I watched her before she saw me, and I noticed that she wasn't wearing the ring, the garnet Ross ring she used to tap against every glass to tell a room how much smarter she was. Her hand was bare. Whether she'd sold it or simply couldn't bear the sound of it anymore, I'll never know. She saw me then, and there was a small, terrible second where the old, warm public smile started to arrive on her face out of pure habit. The smile she'd handed me across 100 dinners, like a knife. And then it didn't finish. It just stopped, halfway, the way her finger had stopped on the ring in that courtroom. She looked at me, and she looked at the apple in her hand, and she put it back. And she turned and pushed her cart down the next aisle without a word. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. I picked out my own apples, and I paid for them with my own money, which is a thing she never learned to do. And I drove the 90 minutes home to Harbor Reach, where the lake was going pewter for the winter. And I opened the shop, and I put on the kettle, and I got back to work. That's the whole story. You'd have done the same. You just might not have waited as long. And the waiting, I promise you, was the best part.